Okay, we're back with a session of First Light still, and where are we this week?
Where are we this week? We're in Tim Parkin's house in Leeds.
And where are we going?
In the roof. We're going to Scotland,
yeah.
to the Lairig Ghru, first of all, in the Highlands, the Cairngorms. It's one of the most remote major glens in Scotland, and a place that holds fantastic memories for me. And it was a place where I've made a number of pictures now.
This was part of the Scotland's Mountains.
Scotland's Mountains. Seems appropriate to do it just now because of the weather outside. I've just come from snowy Great Ayton to come down here.
And that's first dramatic snowfall of the year.
It was fantastic. Where are these pictures, Tim? This is the only thing about using somebody else's computer.
Top left is a Lacey link.
Yep. Not in the New Mexico folder. Here we are. New First Light. And if we move, first of all, to the picture that, if I can just open this, I'll just double click, will it open in Photoshop?
Click, I think.
Here we go. The first picture we're going to look at is the one that appears in Scotland's mountains, and it's one of my favourites. I think it's perhaps one of my favourite pictures of all time, which isn't something I say very often, because I genuinely do find it difficult to distinguish my own pictures. Not one from the other, of course, but you have a number of emotions that accompanies each image, and genuinely there is a feeling that every picture has its own life and validity, and I couldn't really distinguish which was my favourite most of the time. But there's something about the experience that I had making this picture that makes it so special. It was very, very remote the nearest road is about 7 or 8 miles away, and in fact 8 or more miles. The picture was made at an air temperature of about -10 in a place that I had revered for many years in my mind. I'd never been there before, so it was made on my first visit. And it's special to me because the context was so powerful. The very low temperatures, the remoteness, the amount of sheer physical effort and endeavour that was required to reach this place, and the feeling that I had one chance to do it. It wasn't going to be somewhere I could go back and photograph again.
Not in those conditions.
Certainly not. No. Well, of course it does. There are conditions like that from time to time, but that particular winter, I think 2 or 3 years ago now, we had we didn't have the sort of cold that we had last winter. I imagine one could have perhaps seen that sort of thing more frequently last winter, but given the schedule that I was working to at the time, it was a rare opportunity.
So did you walk the 8 miles to get there?
I did, yes, yeah.
And this is dawn, I presume?
It is dawn, so I literally spent the previous day walking in. I walked in with 18 kilograms of camera gear plus 5 or 6 kilograms of survival gear, sleeping bag, roll mat, and cooking kit. Mostly the water I expected to drink because I wasn't sure what the water source would be like, but having said that, I did end up having to use snow and melt it down to drink, which of course is generally pretty safe to do. And I slept in a bothy overnight in the middle of this in the mountains here. But when I arrived at the bothy, it was becoming dark. I'd in fact walked the previous hour in the dying light and was very concerned whether I was actually going to make it at all. And the first thing I did when I arrived at the bothy was to set the camera up on a tripod and open the shutter and then walk inside the bothy. And so I made a night picture as well, but that's another story, or a star trail picture. The picture I really, really intended to make with this long journey in was of a mountain called the Devil's Point, and I'll talk more about that later. The Devil's Point is a striking feature. It's actually it is the southernmost buttress of Cairntoul, which is the fourth largest mountain in Britain, and it's got a tremendous presence in the landscape, somewhat similar to Buccleuch Moor on Ranach Moor. And in the Cairngorms, the biggest problem that presents itself to the photographer is that the mountains are quite gentle looking on the face of it, certainly from a distance. They're high, sure, but they are very spread out and big plateaus, rolling shapes, rather than the dramatic steep cliffs and buttresses and ridges that you get further west. So, and I suppose part of me was sort of yearning for that kind of drama. I knew of this one great buttress, the Devil's Point, that perhaps would offer that kind of drama. So the Devil's Point was really my main focus. When I actually arrived during the previous day, I realised I was really going to struggle to make that work. Nevertheless, the landscape was tremendous, and I went to bed feeling optimistic. In fact, I went to bed having had a very interesting experience the night before. I'd arrived, sure enough, as it was getting dark. I was the only person in the bothy, and I assumed that I would be spending the night there on my own. When I came out of having cooked myself some food, and literally I had a tea candle, a couple of tea candles, and it was unbelievably cold. I was wearing everything I had, and had my sleeping bag around my shoulders. And I noticed, looking through the window out into the night sky, that there's this tiny light in the landscape. And describing the scale of the landscape is really, really difficult when you're sitting in a house, because it's just so vast. But when it's that clear and that dark, you can see things at extraordinary distances. I could see this head torch 3 miles away. So I saw this head torch. Somebody is coming to the bothy, and then a little while later, I noticed a head torch coming from the other direction. And by some curious coincidence, these two, as it turned out, groups emerged out of the darkness of the night, just as I was finishing my 1 hour exposure made with the ebony. And there was one solo climber who walked in from the north, and 3 who'd come in from the south. And because they'd sort of set off relatively late in the day to come to the bothy, they'd end up arriving literally in the night. And as I write in the book, I mean, I thought I was doing something pretty hardcore. Well, these guys, not only are they'd set off with similar kind of amount of kit to me, none of it photographic, by the way, this is all climbing gear. Yeah. But they'd set off pretty much towards dusk from various car parks, one in Aviemore and one on the Braemar side at the Linn of Dee, and converged at the bothy, halfway through the evening, in order to go climbing on Cairntoul here the following day. So it was quite interesting, because I spent half the evening chatting to them.
You seem to have a quiet night then.
Not really. Well, actually, it was fairly quiet, because by the time they'd cooked their food and talked about climbing stories, mostly epics in the mountain, and talking about avalanche risk and all of that sort of thing, and all the people they knew, and I was like wide-eyed. Oh my goodness! And the avalanche risk on this night was around 3, which is average. It's not disastrous. It's not 5, but it certainly wasn't inconsiderable. There'd been a lot of fresh snow, as you can see from this picture.
Did you have to climb much to get up to there, or is that fairly?
No, I mean the truth is that this was a walk, and it was a hard walk, not because it was difficult from the ascent, the 7 miles into the mountains. Most of it is up and down a bit, but it was a gradual ascent. This level is about 600 meters above sea level. Oh, right. The mountains themselves, this is Cairntoul. On the other side, out of sight, is Ben Macdui, which is the second highest mountain in Britain, is these are around 600-700 meters above. That doesn't look it, but it is above this level. And these are serious mountains by British standards. I've just been reading a Chris Bonington book about climbing in the Himalayas. So there, when we're talking meters, you're talking thousands of meters rather than hundreds. So I realise this puts it all very much into perspective.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, Scotland in the middle of winter is quite a serious undertaking. And I was also very aware that it's all very well to go in there, but you've still got to be on your mettle. You've still got to be making photographs that count. And I was using 5x4 film, which was fine in the sense that the lenses, the Copal clockwork shutters that we use on large format cameras are very reliable, and they do work in low temperatures.
Yeah.
There was no worries about batteries failing that digital cameras are constantly having to face. So that side of it was fine. The real test for me was, could I function well in such extreme conditions, in very remote conditions? I actually found the whole experience fantastically inspiring, although it was hard. I mean, walking that distance, carrying that much kit, is hard.
Walking through snow is hard, isn't it?
Well, the other thing I hadn't said was that the snow in part was getting up to 1 metre deep, and I kept breaking through crusty snow. And I don't know, anybody who's done that will know that you break through, you get jolt, you're carrying all this kit, and then you have to get up and do another step, and there are parts of it where you think, I'm never going to make it. You got to this remote spot, you're breaking trail the whole way, and you try walking 7 miles on a pavement, that's quite hard because it's hard on the legs. You try doing that through breaking trail through metre deep snow, that is another level of hard.
It's worse than walking on dry sand.
Oh yeah, much worse. Much worse than walking on soft sand. Anyway, I don't want to complain. I'm not. It was wonderful, but
well, it's interesting because some people get attached. I get attached to pictures. If I've struggled to get a picture in terms of getting there, in terms of conditions, and in terms of working really hard on a picture, I value it more. And there is an emotional investment and physical investment that comes into pictures sometimes. There
is, and I think that any landscape photographer will tell you the same. However much you know that the history will judge you by the picture for its own sake, you cannot detach yourself from those stories and those experiences. So, having said all of that, I was very conscious that I needed to bring back that experience in a distilled form that would communicate itself to others, and that was what I needed to do. And because I mustn't spend too long talking about the experience, I should talk about the picture. I set the alarm on my mobile phone for 2 hours before sunrise, which wasn't that early, by the way. That would have been about 6 in the morning.
When was this? December?
It was actually in early February.
Oh, right.
But it's still that far north.
Yeah.
Sunrise is still quite late. That would have been around 8 o'clock. I was completely dark when I got up. I knew I would have to eat something, so I didn't want to disturb the other guys. The bothy, by the way, is about the floor plan is about half the space of the room that we're in here. So I was lucky I had the shelf to myself, but the other guys were just on the floor, four of them. I had to step over them in order to get out, and I made porridge outside in the dark. I managed to kick the stove over, so I ended up with half the porridge on the snow. Salvaged what I could, ate what I could of it, and cursing, and set off into the dawn twilight. By then, I knew that there wasn't a picture to be made right outside the door. I had to get away from the bothy. I had to get a considerable distance from the bothy so that it would disappear or at least become remote in the landscape. I also needed to kind of tune myself in.
Is this looking back towards where you came from then?
No, it isn't. It's looking up into the heart of the Lairig Ghru, and you can see this U-shaped glaciated valley. Eventually, it sort of levels out here. That is the highest point, or close to it. It's underneath a mountain called Lairig, which is actually the third highest mountain in Britain. So you've got McDewey, Lairig and Cairn Toul. They are the second, third and fourth highest mountains in the UK after Ben Nevis. And then the glen literally drops off the other side towards Aviemore. And it's a great sort of transect kind of walk from one side of the Cairngorms to the other. Very famous. And that's why there were 4 other people there, because even though it was midweek, midwinter, there's always a few people around in this. Very, very hardcore people, of course, but nevertheless, it's an iconic location. Having said all of that, I'd never seen a photograph of it in the middle of winter from the middle of the glen, so I didn't really know what to expect, and I was grateful for that, because one of the things that we discuss quite a lot is making images in locations that you've seen many photographs of before. And it remains quite challenging, I think, to do that. You don't want to repeat what other people have done, but nevertheless, you're always kind of slightly intimidated by such images, because they do have a resolution about them. And Colin Pryor's work, particularly, tends to haunt my memory, because I know his work so well, and he's been everywhere, almost, as it were, before I ever got there. I walked away from the bothy and crossed the river via a little footbridge that there is right in, near the bothy, but it's still hard walking, and I now was under pressure from time, because the dawn was starting to emerge from the twilight, and
when you can see the light going, it's
pressure
on a bit,
the pressure rises, and the place actually had become featureless. There was so much snow everywhere, and all the rocks were covered. I mean, this is a rocky place, but and I was starting to get a little bit desperate. I didn't really know, and essentially I thought I have to pare the elements down to the minimum. And really, the feature that seemed the most significant, and I realised fairly soon I had to use. I don't remember whether I had a lot of conscious thought, but I was drawn back to the river in the end. And
can we make this full screen for people so they get the biggest?
Yes. How can I do that?
F, and then Apple 0. Apple. Command 0.
Yeah. Oh, sorry about that. Why don't you do that?
All right.
This is. Beg your pardon. There's a trouble. There you go. Not using your own kit.
I should say that it's on my computer, so Joe's not familiar with it.
I beg your pardon. But then I never think of myself as a computer expert anyway, quite rightly. So in the end, in the end, it all happened relatively quickly. I mean, I say it happened relatively quickly, but then the great thing about working in Scotland is that the solar path is shallow, especially in the winter, so you can see the light coming, but you still have time to work. And it's one of the beauties of not working close to the equator.
Slow motion sunrise.
Slow-mo photography, and for slow, large format photographers, that's quite an important consideration. The river wasn't what you call beautiful. It was covered in this slob ice, which tends to form. Obviously, it's still quite a lot of energy in the water. Because it's a steepish environment.
It's forming some fantastic shapes.
It is. But when I got closer to it, I couldn't find a way of making a centered composition, which typically is a way one might adopt to create, if you like, an iconic kind of image from a place.
Was this you think about standing in the middle of the river at some point?
You try standing in.
Yeah, I was thinking that might be
that was one of the things that occurred to me, but my sense of survival was stronger than that. My feet weren't that warm as it was, and in fact, when I made this picture, I still had my old climbing boots, which weren't very good either. So I was struggling a bit with the conditions. I ended up realising I would have to work from one side and use what in compositional terms is if you like classical tactics of the diagonal lines. I needed more elevation. I couldn't find anywhere that gave me as much height as I would have liked. here I needed to be close enough to the river to create a suitably corresponding diagonal, but at the same time not so close that I was down, which creates compression.
Flattens the face of the river.
Exactly. So the compromise here was to find, a linear approach which corresponded with the shape of the mountain, that still retained a zigzag. So you can see in the distance how the shape is repeated, and just by implication, the eye is drawn into the heart of the glen. In the far distance, you can see on this face here just a feeling of the mountain beyond, and then the pink light of dawn. I had done some work in Photoshop on it. If I just revert to the unchanged image, we can see.
So that's as taken.
Basically, yes, and as scanned at home on the Imicon. So I'm not sure if I've done any basic work to it, but the layers are intended to. Sorry, that's the wrong one. There we are. What am I doing wrong here?
We might be able to use that Alt key instead.
Alt key. Oops. Come on.
No,
let's just go manually. Switch them back on. Essentially, to take out colour, what I felt in the end was a colour cast. So on my monitor at home, I think it's slightly more noticeable. There we are. What I've actually looked for with these two adjustments that I've made is to lighten and reduce the blue and to some extent the pink.
Yes, so there's a combination of the magenta that Velvia would have thrown into it.
Yes.
And also some of the blue from just the fact that we got cold light from the sky, presumably.
Funnily enough, I would say, going back, I would say that in, as it were, scientific terms, this is probably the colour that it was.
Yeah.
You get quite a strong blue because the sky was mostly blue, but with the pink. Yes, the Velvia probably does ramp up the saturation a little bit, but it's still I think it's quite acceptable. But I strongly recall, and perhaps this comes from having spent a lot of time in snow over the last 2 winters, that's not how you actually see it. You see white.
Well, this
is
is
feeling of
called
whiteness.
a constancy thing that David talks about occasionally, and the fact that our eyes compensate for any global cast that surrounds us through our peripheral vision. We have an auto white balance that's quite good.
We do, and that is that in a sense is it's always a debate. I mean, I think you can justify using colour casts, and especially in the winter and snow, because the colour can speak of and imply the sensory cold. However, to me, this lighter, whiter version takes me back to the moments in a way that the blue version seems more stylized.
Yes.
So I'm happier with it. I've actually made no masks and really no adjustments beyond taking saturation out of the blues and brightening it up globally.
Yeah. There's an awful lot of shaping light in the snow. I mean, for the fact it is fairly monotone or monocolour.
Yes.
It's fantastic the way it describes the shapes of the hills and the draping of the snow.
I think there's a couple of elements going on there. First of all, the mountain itself being higher is exposed to more light. The glen is naturally shaded, so there's a kind of a subtlety and a softness about that works. There is also this little band of pink, which is the sun, the beyond, still below the horizon, lighting the top of the cloud back there. There's a relatively mysterious combination of elements, because I mean, I couldn't make out exactly what was happening. I didn't know if I was going to get early sun. In fact, as it turned out, I did.
Where was the sun coming from? Presumably to your left.
It was from almost behind me.
Okay, right.
From the southeast. Here, looking pretty much due north into the glen, so a bit from behind and from the right slightly over my shoulder. There were, I'm going to point out what I would regard as flaws in this composition, and you know, anybody can make their own view of it. I was quite disturbed by these little patches of black, and I wondered if there was anything I could do about it. Of course I couldn't. If as soon as I walk into this landscape, then I've disturbed the sense of this is pristine, the whole kind of image.
You didn't have time to throw snowballs at it.
No, and of course I wouldn't probably have done that. But anyway, I came to the conclusion that, and I've had to think about these things often, the images of this kind of pure snow has all these associations of purity and so on, temporary of course, but there's something quite riveting about being in a place so remote and seeing it in this snow-clad, unblemished. I mean, to be fair, one of the climbers had in fact walked through it the previous evening, but so far away you can't see his footprints, and there's this impression of unspoilt beauty. So to me, it's about as close to a feeling of wilderness as you're ever going to find in the UK, and I wanted to preserve that feeling, and that was, the compositional device is very, very simple, but you can argue that it's the symbol of the journey, moving through the picture space into the unknown, and so I was vaguely conscious of the potential ways that the image could be read. I mean, it's a scene in a place. It's not something that I've constructed, but I think because of the snow and the rather epic nature of the place, it can be understood in ways beyond the mere surface facts, if you like. And I was concerned that these little patches of black would distract from that. In practice, I don't think they're a great problem. I mean,
it never bothered me personally.
Snowy landscapes have these kind of
it's texture again, isn't it?
It is texture, yeah.
How long did you have to? I mean, once you were set up, how long did you spend waiting for the conditions, and how many frames?
I made 3 exposures.
Yeah.
I had very little time. It was constantly shifting. I could tell that if I didn't get on and do it right away, that the colour in the sky would go, and that's exactly what did happen.
Yeah.
And the picture I'm going to show you shortly was taken a little after, by which time the quality of the light completely changed and doesn't have the same atmosphere or resonance that the quality of light imparted here, perhaps partly by luck, does have. So that was the bottom line.
So potentially that reading that you're talking about, saying it's a journey where into the unknown, that could have informed you choosing to take the picture where the clouds are draping the background.
Absolutely, and I'm pretty sure that they didn't last like that for long. So the way the clouds sit on the mountains, any mountaineer experienced hill walker will know, does tend to change enormously at sunrise and particularly at sunset as the sun comes up. So the particles of the air are warmed or changed, altered. Don't forget, minus 10 to 15, and with that, currents move the clouds around a great deal. So it is these are transient and temporary moments. So although I'm working with a view camera, then I'm also having to work quickly, and that's 3 exposures, and I'm pretty sure that after that, well, I was under pressure not to use too much film. Carrying all that kit, I'd only taken I think 15 sheets with me. I'd made some the previous evening. I knew I needed to make some later, so I was calculating that as well. I knew that this was going to be special, but how special, I don't know. Incidentally, I think landscape photographers particularly will be interested to know how it was filtered. It wasn't filtered.
Right. Yeah.
A straight shot.
Because of the snow. Is that fairly common in a snowy condition?
Yes. Yeah. There's one of the beauties of working in snow is that snow tends to sort of equalise the light, and also it's very hard to use a graduated filter in these conditions because you can so easily end up with a tide mark. But why would you? Because why would you use it anyway?
Yeah.
There was very little contrast.
And just for the film users, how do you pick an exposure for that? Because it's fairly low contrast, I would imagine.
Thinking process is what are the highlights and the low areas, the dark areas where you need to retain detail. My motivation would almost certainly be look at this and pick out the bright spots. There is a bright spot in here, but let's look at the top of cone tool. I would want to retain texture and colour in there. I would also wish to retain texture and colour in the slob ice in the river. Pick that point, observe the differences between probably 2 to 3 stops, not a huge range, go between them.
Yeah.
And there we are, a mid-tone. Why would I do that? Because I want to retain texture. This would probably be at +1 from my normal exposure. These tones very likely would be somewhere around +0.5.
Yeah.
So yes, they've still got masses of colour in, but they should start to look light, not a mid-tone, because snow is after all light.
Yes.
It speaks of light.
You don't
But
want to push it too far.
No,
it'll
because
start losing all the textures.
that's right. Because if you push it too far, this would be white as in white, a white hole in transparency. So I know from previous experience, you overexpose blues with Velvia, you get overexposure. There's no details. So it's very, very important not to go beyond +1.5 in these bright areas of snow.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So the second part of the Lairig Ghru shoot.
Yes, and this is the picture which I made almost simultaneously with the first image. And the reason I want to show this is A, it shows context, but B, there's a kind of interesting byproduct. Should we go apple zeros if that works? No.
Yeah.
Well, no, I'm definitely doing something wrong here.
It's,
Is it the wrong tab?
No, it's just
Yeah, it needs the magic of Tim to make it work.
Absolutely. There we go.
Okay. This, from memory, and I hope this is right, but nobody can contradict me, I suppose, because nobody else was there. This is made actually from the same place, literally almost the same tripod position as the previous image, but a short while later. And it's almost through 180 degrees.
Yeah.
You can see in the distance the bothy.
Oh, is that the boss?
Yeah, so can I just go Apple A and just see, I don't know how high res this is.
Wow.
Before the other climbers got up, but it gives you an idea of the scale of it,
Yes.
which is quite fun. This is the Devil's Point here.
It's a dramatic face, isn't it?
It is, and
Glacial carving, I presume.
it is. It's sheared off. I mean, actually, if you think of Yosemite, which is
Yes.
the kind of archetypical glaciated valley, the face of Half Dome looks almost exactly the same as
Very
this,
similar, isn't it?
only
Yeah.
more dramatic.
Yeah.
This is not quite so cleanly carved, but you can absolutely see the way that the ridge once probably intruded into the valley, and it's been cut off directly by the glacier.
There's another aspect of the clean air you can see there, because that bothy doesn't look as far away as it obviously was to walk.
Exactly. It is a long way. I say that it's about a mile
Yeah.
from where I made this image, and both the previous picture and this one were shot with the 90mm lens, so it's a relatively wide angle in context. The previous picture was made very much with what you might call following light, so that the luminance of it arrived as a result of the direction of the rising sun and the clouds that were over the top of me.
And that was before sunrise, wasn't it, the previous?
Yes, and this is as well, but not long. So a little bit later, the sun is still starting to rise, but you can just detect a kind of warming.
Yeah. So the
below.
previous one was probably 20 minutes before sunrise?
I would say so.
Yeah.
20 to 25 minutes. This now is probably 10 minutes before, maybe 5,
Yeah.
or before the sun is rising over the distant mountains. And I was expecting this to be a precursor to what would be probably the best picture, and I was expecting the rising sun to strike this face, and for there to be perhaps the best image. I was kind of in my mind's eye. I was seeing. In fact, unfortunately, I can't show you what did happen, and I did make some photographs of it, but it didn't work at all.
Right.
That was the interesting thing. This, which I don't regard as successful as the previous picture, is the best of them.
Right.
Which is why I have a scan of it. The others I've never scanned. But I did end up with a kind of strong sunlight, strong shadow in here,
Yes.
and then literally a line of light running up this slope. Now, if you described that to me beforehand, I would have said that's going to be the picture. That'll be the one that makes it, that really rocks. That's not what happened.
Did it take all the shape away from the picture, or distract from it? Or?
What happened is it essentially it creates an excess of contrast.
Yeah.
So you have sunlight on brilliant snowfields,
Okay.
blue sky with no clouds. You can see at least here you can detect a little bit
nothing
of
to fill the shadows in.
nothing at all. It's just blue sky, harsh, hard, and then this black water seems even more black. And so what happened to it was that the contrast simply completely overwhelmed and dominated the scene. At least here there's still some sense of luminosity, but the effect on the image is of the absence of cloud is really what spoils it for me. I think experienced landscape photographers might well look at this view and think, he polarized it. Why? Because it's light here and it's dark here.
Yes.
And yet the snow slope, I did not polarize it. That is,
It's just natural.
yeah,
Colour.
what you might call semi-polarized air, because it's at relatively high altitude.
Very clear air as well.
Very clear air, wide-angle lens. The one thing that I could probably do to improve this, and you can probably see there isn't much work done to it, but if we were to go to blue and desaturate a little, I mean, perhaps somewhere in there, then it actually does detract, sadly, from the sky. It does probably improve the look of the...
Yeah. There's quite a large contrast range in the sky there, isn't it? It's probably one, apart from the river itself, it's the darkest area of the picture is the sky in the background.
Yes, exactly. I mean, in point of fact, you could go with that, and arguably, if we were doing a Photoshop thing here, we could perhaps paint back, take out the effect of the desaturation in the sky, and get something that had more of an emotional affinity with what I was seeing. But since I'm not familiar with CS4, I don't want to make a fool of myself. We'll leave it as it is for now, and just talk through a little bit about why this is less successful. It's now lost some of that kind of mystery. Well, the mystery isn't. It's clearly absent in this image, and the colour is dominated by the blue, and perhaps most importantly, the river, which leads out of the frame here, doesn't have that way of that in the previous picture where it led into the heart of the glen, and leaves you with a sense of what now. Whereas I feel with this, it just leads out of the picture space. And although I was thinking, I hope in a good way about these shapes being compatible, and the curves being balanced and so on, I'm also conscious of the fact that the black water creates quite a brittle quality that doesn't have the same luminescence that I think is present in the previous image.
In that slab ice, the slob, whatever it is.
Slob, that's right. Yeah.
It had a lot of character looking in the other direction, and it's broken up there, hasn't it?
It has, and it's literally... Well,
to use the word messy, but it looks
I'm afraid
scattered.
that we do, don't we? And in fact, if you look closely, you'll see that the slob ice actually pretty much gives out at this point.
Yeah.
So while it's further up the glen, where it's that bit colder, it's retained in part, and maybe because of the rate of flow in this particular area of the river, it's actually sort of fallen away. So what remains here is the snow sitting on on boulders, and that's kind of intriguing in its own right. But the slob ice is further up and in, and in fact, the further up altitude you gain, the more the river actually freezes over.
Yeah.
So this is almost the point where the river starts to re-emerge,
Yes.
if you will, from.
Possibly the reason you stopped at that point to take a picture up the river.
I think it is. It was a combination of that, this little bank which gave me elevation,
Yeah.
and the fact that I'm now far enough away from the bothy, and the fact that the dawn was coming on.
Yes.
So yeah, even though you might think, well, you've got yourself into the optimum conditions, of course, in the end you are reacting and responding to what's possible.
It's all compromise.
Yeah. If I'd had more time, I'd probably have walked further up the glen, to see what all the different ramifications were. But in a given moment in time, you have to make the most of the conditions. So there was I, really genuinely believing that this picture was the one that was going to give me the kind of, the high point of the day. As it turned out, it was the picture I made earlier, which was probably the most effective.
How did you plan this picture? Because you obviously, from the sounds of it, had an idea of what it would be. So had you looked at the maps and figured the river would go there, and
I had
the mountain in the background?
Let me show you, if this isn't going off script here, by closing this down a second, and we're going to look at another picture which I made the previous afternoon. I was going to say evening, but in fact it was probably 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And this is another, if you like, reject, although it does appear in Scotland's mountains. To my mind, this is not so effective. But what's important about it, I mean, it's effective enough, is that this is what I thought I was coming for. So if we look at this full frame, hit O rather than 0, sorry. That was the answer. Yeah, Apple 0.
If you press F again, you can get it to
disappear. Thank you. It was that face of the Devil's Point that I had in mind in terms of both the dawn light and so on and so forth. In fact, I'd hoped I was going to get a dusk image of it as well. I'd actually thought I'll go and sleep in the bothy and come back out.
Can you tell me where the bothy is from there?
I can. It is up and over and beyond.
Oh, I see. If you're looking at the other side, that's the slab face, the right-hand side of that.
Approaching from the south,
Yeah.
we're up and around. So the very first picture is actually taken from up and through and around and in.
Yeah.
Beyond the bothy, another 2 miles in, 2.5 miles in. So it's a long way. So I'd already realised by the time I got to the bothy, I'm not going to make it back to this point for dawn. I'm as tired as I was, and I also realised that it hadn't inspired me in the way that I'd hoped. That the problem was I probably had the buckle in my mind, buckleted more, and that pyramid. Well, it turned out it wasn't quite a pyramid, at least not from this angle.
Yeah.
The last picture I'm going to show you gives a different view again.
Okay.
So, should we go to that now?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, well, if you imagine, if I very briefly say, why doesn't this work? Well, it's okay, it's all right, it's got some merit, but it doesn't have the kind of iconic quality that I was really looking for, and I felt that the first picture did. Bear in mind that these sort of long journeys into the mountains, if you're going to go to all that effort, you're looking to make a picture that really, really distills the essence of mountain, and it has something that goes beyond, the kind of surface description. I think as surface description, this works fine. It shows the deep midwinter quality, but I felt it lacked a certain something.
There's a slight two-dimensionality to the mountain there, isn't it?
Yes, there is.
Planar rather than...
There's a cast shadow, isn't there? There isn't a sense of engagement and involvement in perhaps the way that the other image has. So if we go to the final image, that will be here, and this is really the one that got away in my mind, and I'll say why. First of all, because when we were preparing the images for the book, I showed it to Eddie, my good friend, designer, colleague, and he was of the view that this was perhaps too obvious. What do I press? F again. He's right in a way, but I'd like to defend it, and I'll talk a bit about it. First of all, for anybody who's interested in the lie of the land, that previous image was made from back down here, of the Devil's Point looking up there. This is the Devil's Point here. The bothy is out of sight down in here. So the very first picture was made from further up in the glen, and that cairn tool is the mountain in the background that you see from where I'm shooting from underneath in the first picture. So this image is made from Glen Louisbeg on the walk out that I made later in the day. Going back to the very first picture, that was made, if we recall, at dawn down in there, in the heart of the glen, when the clouds were still partially down. Then the second picture was made looking back.
That's the slab face on the right-hand side of that.
Exactly, where the glacier has been and cut it off. The Devil's Point, by the way, appears high there. It is actually several hundred feet lower than Cairn Tool here in the background. So there's a lot of compression in this perspective, and there's probably 2 miles between that point and that point, I would guess. So there's a long ridge.
Rare, not showing as much recession.
Exactly. So, and then the third image, which we briefly considered, was down here, looking back up, but we gave that rather sort of slab-sided front view of the Devil's Point. So in practice, I had not seen this view of the Devil's Point when I arrived, first of all, coming up Glen Dee and approaching it from the south to begin with. So I didn't even know about this angle. So I actually discovered this angle on the walk out, by which time I had 3 sheets of film left. Anyway, just to briefly complete the story, having made my dawn picture and then the other pictures, and I actually continued to work there, making little cameos and trying to develop a better idea, feeling frustrated by that strong sunlight that I described. The fact that the cloud and the mist disappeared, and I was left with, well, scenically amazing things to see, but it was photographically very difficult. And by midday, the sun had arrived at where I was standing, and I'd been literally working in a shadow all morning, trying to use reflected light, which is a tactic I often use in the winter. Not really making a great deal of progress. So now, from midday, I now was thinking, got to get back to the safety of the car. I didn't have food for another day or another night, and I also knew that the weather was changing. I'd had a forecast that had given me the sort of 24 hours of fine high pressure, and then more cloud piling in from the west, and another weather system, and probably a great deal more snow. I didn't want to be. It was hard enough walking through this as it was. So I was now in the escape mode. Midday. This was shot about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. I knew I had about 3 hours at least or more of walking, and that it would be dark by the time I got back to the car. So you're counting down time, and although I don't want to kind of labour the point, there is a kind of genuine narrative to the context of making images in these conditions, and that is you have to survive and get out the other side.
Because a lot of people do perish in conditions like this every year, don't they, in Scotland? They
do, and although when conditions are fine, it's still very, very cold. So you're still well below freezing. If you look closely at, I don't know if this the resolution of this image will allow it. I think it does.
You can see the crystalline.
When you see ice crystals in the snow like that, that means it's certainly below freezing. It's usually well below freezing. I would judge that by this time of the afternoon, the temperature had risen to about -5. So this is temperate, balmy almost, but it's still very, very cold, and you do need the right conditions to survive. To be honest, you can die of hypothermia at 7 or 8 degrees if you get wet. So in some ways, below freezing is good because at least you generally stay dry. So I'm not frightened of the conditions, but nevertheless, remaining active and knowing that you've got somewhere safe to go to is important.
Being wary.
Yeah. So taking care, obviously. So, and bear in mind what it's like now to walk through. So I've been over there and was now making my way back through and around. All the time when you're walking, you're thinking, am I going to want to photograph this? So, because, you know, clearly you can't really photograph it. Well, you can photograph your footsteps, but that's another kind of photograph. That's a
you don't want to walk into your photograph.
Documentary photograph. You don't want to walk into your photograph. So I had spotted these boulders as I was now on my escape route, thinking, and I'd also realised that there was a wonderful view back to this marginal view into the Lairig Ghru. And I want to talk briefly about the composition of this picture, because although by now the light, middle of the day, the colour is more neutral and perhaps lacking in that sense, you can see there's still masses of shadow, cast shadow, textural shadow, and because the sun, even though it's midday, is low in the sky, because it's winter, because the solar path is low, the shadows are long, and the potential for a photograph is still there. There's still lots of opportunity to describe depth. When I got to this point, I realised that this was probably going to be my very last opportunity to photograph the heart of the glen, the Devil's Point, and I was down now to my last 3 sheets of film. So I was thinking, what am I going to do? I've got to, again, it's distill the essence out of the opportunity. I knew that my previous image with the river, 2 previous pictures have mainly been very much about the river. They've been shot with either wide-angle lens, large landscape, or I'd done 1 or 2 long lens images, 2 or 3 actually, of the river, the boulders, the snow, reflected light. I had high hopes for those. As it turned out, they didn't really come to much. So I was very much drinking from the last chance saloon here, and so the pressure was on. The 2 boulders, it struck me, had an obvious kind of rapport with the 2 mountains. I wanted to make an image that would create a connection and a kind of an arrangement of depth. So if we unpick briefly the compositional elements, you can see this is a tactic I'll use quite often. I may have cropped it slightly, but I would have drawn the shadows to a notch or a kind of a needle point on the edge of the frame. That's a kind of point.
Trying not to break the edge of the frame.
Yeah, kind of point of tension.
Yeah.
If you will.
Projecting from the.
It's a kind of projection out point, if you like. So I would call that an energy point, energy center. The other very important element to this image was that this large area of cast shadow was likely to become dominant.
Yeah.
If you imagine that picture without the rock, then suddenly you've got this great slab of blue shadow. So obviously, seems obvious to me now, placed that rock against the blue shadow to create light and shade. So use that area of cast shadow as a kind of springing point to project form forward. So that's what it's meant to be doing there.
Creates a lot more depth in that area of the picture.
Correct. And then on the right hand side, that's balanced by another area of cast shadow. So you've got cast shadow, and then that.
Yeah, because without the shadow in the bottom right of the picture, it would be still very heavily weighted to the top left.
Yes, and this is also a framing device in a relatively straightforward sense. Dark edges will drive energy forward into the space. So there's clearly a diagonal line moving through there, and there's a shallow diagonal that echoes it there, moving into the Lairig Ghru. And then you've got light against dark. You've also got kind of light against dark here, at the relatively darker foreground. So there are a number of compositional devices at work here, and I mean, maybe I've worked too hard on them. There's even this little line of shadow. I don't know if you noticed that was. I remember thinking carefully: is that good? Is that bad?
How do I place it against
the
rock
do I
in the
want
foreground?
Exactly. I remember moving in and out, thinking. And in the end, I decided to just let it go, because I based my camera position ultimately on proportion. the proportion of the rocks in relation to the mountains, and trying to have a satisfactory, resolution of that, and that's where I came to.
I do like the little snippet of river in the middle of it as well. Yeah.
Picture within picture.
Yeah.
And we've talked about that quite a lot in the past, but large format photography particularly lends itself to that notion. I would argue actually that is something that isn't really very present in the dawn glowing picture. It's very much a kind of resolved one picture, one idea, whereas this at least does have a number of little kind of cameos within, and that is an aspect of it that I like. And certainly the crystalline snow, heavily frosted the night before, still in its state of frost.
Can we have a look at that at full?
Of course, yeah. So that's it. In fact, this is a test for me, isn't it? And I think we'll see. This is unsharpened, by the way. I'll just defend myself here.
I wasn't trying to criticise your focusing.
No, well, it's not that bad, is it?
It's pretty good.
I think bear in mind that my Imicon, I have the sharpening not just turned off, but at minus 120.
Yeah.
So there's no sharpening artifacts whatsoever. So this is just the sharpness of the lens that we're seeing on screen.
It's a wonderful glow in those crystal, like feather-shaped crystals.
Yeah, I think the wonders of nature. I mean, isn't it miraculous? It's like a forest of crystals, and that's as much an effect of frost as it is of fallen snow.
Yeah.
And there's
layers of frost on snow thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then we come into the sunlight, and then we drop out again. Now this is interesting, and large format photographers will enjoy this, I hope. It's out of focus in here. Let's go a bit further in.
We're back in again.
Sorry, I think it's going to do something silly there or something.
Just escaping.
Yeah, we are effectively now back in focus. The rock face, and that's decent. The summit is fine, and if we look across the cam tool, all of this is effectively in focus. So if we back off, again, large format photographers will recognise this effect, which is that I've used tilt to connect the foreground to probably a point in the middle of the distant landscape, which of course also coincides with the rock here. So that's nice and crisp, and our rock here.
Large format cameras are very clever, but they can only put the plane of focus on a flat surface. So
exactly. So yeah, we've got a situation where the sort of distant, if you like, the middle ground is slightly soft. But having said that, when I make a print of this at say 24 or 30 inches wide, you don't really notice that as being soft. So it's all relative.
Yes. Yeah, well, that's wonderful.
And I don't know if we're at a conclusion point as yet as such, but the nice thing about for me is that I feel that this is it's a kind of hard-working composition. You know, I've kind of clearly done quite a lot of effort trying to bring it all together. Is it a classic? Well, probably not. I think it probably lacks some kind of killer quality for it to be that. But it's a picture that I really do enjoy looking at. It really, really reminds me of the place. Certainly it has a lot of meaning for me. I then had to retreat from here, and the walk back was pretty well unbroken. I think I made one more composition. I used up my final sheet of film before heading out, and I arrived back at my van, which was iced up on the outside and on the inside. When I turned on the ignition key, having spent 15 minutes clearing it was now night again, by the way. The thermometer said -9. It was, of course, by a considerably lower altitude back at Linn of Dee. So it just made, I extrapolated forward to the Lairig. Okay, so that was -15 or whatever. Yeah. And you realise that it's quite extreme conditions. So this, in a way, is the connecting picture.
Well, I would hope people, I think people want too much immediacy in photographs sometimes, and I'm starting or trying to. It's very difficult sometimes when you're looking at Flickr streams and you're seeing a lot of photographs. It's difficult to invest an appropriate amount of time in a picture to see if it really starts to expand or start to engage, because you see a lot of pictures, and especially people look at Flickr streams and they look at a thumbnail and go, oh, next, or just next and next.
Yes.
And there are pictures that grow on you, and I think that there's enough going on in that picture, and there's enough to think about and see in it that it quite happily grow on you after a while, and I don't think a picture's necessarily bad because of that.
I totally agree with that, and I mean, it's of course you can't judge your own work. I mean, it would be wrong to in that sense. I'm not saying this is a great picture by any means, but I think it's got merit. I think it's got some things that do definitely work, and I hope other people will enjoy it as well. But for me, because of the context, it'll always have great meaning, and I suppose that's I think we're allowed, aren't we?
Oh yeah,
to have a sentimental attachment of sorts to an image.
We take photographs for ourselves as much as for other people.
Yes, and so while I couldn't persuade Eddie to put this picture in a book, I've still got it, so I'm happy about that.
Well, it'll be on the website, so it'll be interesting to see what other people think of it.
Great.
Thanks.
Pleasure.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.